So my name is Rod Abuhab. I'm an Associate Professor of International Relations here at UCL in the Department of Political Science. We were actually just noting that we are actually homeless from our own department this evening. So we've been evicted by UCL from our own department because we're not allowed to have security there. So thankfully and very generously, engineering are allowing us to all stay here. Okay. So we're here to discuss homelessness in Britain and agenda for change. As of December 2023, 309,000 people, at least 309,000 people were classified as being homeless. This is just in England, and the numbers go up more if you add Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So this can be, for example, people who are sleeping rough, people who are in temporary accommodation. I don't know if it includes people who are sofa surfing, no sofa surfing. Okay, that's just for fun. So this is a really serious issue, right? And so we actually have some of the brightest thinkers in the UK with us this evening to talk about these issues and to see what we can do about it. So we have both policy experts and academics. So Kath Scanlon is from the LSE, and where you've been based for more than 20 years. That's that's impressive. So economist by training. You do research into a broad range of housing topics, in particularly around sort of issues of kind of new affordable housing and the costs of temporary accommodation, and seeing what we can potentially try to do with that, especially in sort of the London Council area, but also kind of more broadly across England and the UK. Alex Steiner is a senior researcher at New Economics Foundation. So you previously were working on the Grenfell Tower fire as a human rights solicitor, representing the bereaved and the survivors there. That must have been a really sort of difficult and ongoing. Is it still? I mean, are you still ongoing?
I'm not, but it is.
Yes.
There's a report due later this year. Yeah.
Okay. And so, apart from that, he's also working on a variety of other housing issues, including about to publish a paper on reforming the right to buy, and is making the case for social housing. Paul Atherton is a filmmaker, playwright, author, and social campaigner, and is also currently experiencing homelessness. So he will be talking about his experiences and his efforts to reduce homelessness by advising Bob Blackman, MP, and the bills they were putting through, and have also written on this topic as well. So thank you for coming. And then last but by no means least, we have Murray Fraser, who is both Professor of Architecture and Global Culture at UCL. So thank you from Bartlett School of Architecture. I noted before that I wanted to be an architect for a long time until I realized I couldn't draw. So I could have been you. Anyway, so you've been working on housing in a wider variety of areas in terms of housing projects. This dates back to your PhD thesis, and you're sort of presently thinking about sustainable, affordable dwellings, and most recently co-author of Design for All, a place to call home, which looks like you may have a copy of it with you. That was done alongside with colleagues from medical colleagues at UCL. So thank you all very much for coming. Each of our speakers has a very long 5 minutes, that's all, to make their points. This is a very complex and sort of complicated issue, but I'm going to hopefully, you can make your sort of 3 or 4 key points you want to make to the audience. I will do my best to keep you all time, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So that's me done, and Murray, if you'd like to begin, thank you.
Okay. So I need to press this button.
Yeah, so it goes green. I'll give it a little slide.
Oh, it's a slide.
Other way.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me well. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Yes, as Rod said, I am an architect. I'm coming here as an architect. I'm most definitely not a housing specialist in economics, law, policy, etc. I'm really looking at this from the idea of housing need. This is the report that was mentioned before. This is a UCL report that we got out quite quickly last year, and it all came about when I was approached by somebody in the medical side of UCL, Professor Rosalind Rain, who's the head of the Applied Health Research, department in UCL, and she was really concerned about the impact of homelessness on health. So it was very much a health-driven kind of initiative, and she was looking for various people to sort of help her to explore this further, etc. She'd been given, I think, some really bad advice by the first people she'd spoken to, which was really about this idea of providing temporary accommodation and homeless hostels, etc., to deal with this problem. And so when she contacted me, I said, Rosalind, I'd be delighted to work with you, but we're going to drop that straight away. And we're going to argue that the only way to deal with this is to build proper permanent housing. She agreed, and then things went fine after that. I think it's quite important to stress this, because the thing that Rosalind, I mean, again, she's the expert on health. She'd be able to give you this in real detail, but she's particularly concerned of all these kind of health problems with the impact on children. Yeah, and I was checked with Alex, and apparently now the figure is 142,000 children are in that category of 309,000. This is a huge sum. This is absolutely blighting lives. As she said, this will blight mental health and physical health and all sorts of things for a huge number of people way into the future. This is really a kind of endemic problem. She's much more passionate about this than me as well. You should listen to her when she starts to expound all the different kind of problems that are going to arise from this as well. So it's really important, yeah. So one of the things we did as part of this report was that she also works with the health economists, etc. And the person in particular was Professor Eleanor Pizzo, also from UCL as well. And so she did this sort of calculation of all the kind of net costs that are involved in sustaining the situation when we have 309,000 people in England in this perilous state of housing, and also more people elsewhere. So they did a very sort of in-depth number crunching exercise, which I would not be able to do in a million years, but they came up with an amazing statistic of something like £6.5 billion a year are spent pretty much, if you factor in all the kind of costs and all the knock-on things, as benefits and everything else that's involved, 6.5 billion a year just in sustaining that, etc. Roughly, it's very hard, obviously, to sort of compute all these statistics, but broadly speaking, there seems to be about £1 billion a year are spent by the English government on providing what we called social housing that's affordable to people on the lowest kind of incomes, etc. So there's about £1 billion of there, and we did our calculations. We went through all this and we looked at the kind of housing need, etc. And it's all in this book, and you can download a PDF, and we reckon that you should be spending at least another 4 billion a year. So 1 billion really should be 5 billion. And even if you did increase it to 5 billion, and obviously this would have to be done over time, it's not just a switch, it would come over time, you would still potentially save 1 billion a year or something like that as well. So we're talking about crazy, crazy economics. We're spending so much money continuing this absolutely terrible situation. So that's really what we wanted to do this as well. So then the physical side, what do you do? What is needed? This is where I could come in, because obviously I was thinking more about buildings and physical stock. And so we did an analysis, and we've got the things there. And we're also building on people like crisis shelters. There's lots of other really excellent researchers, so this is not original research. We're pulling this together. But we reckon that in the end, the argument really is that what we would call this crisis of homelessness now, particularly in England, has been caused by the kind of collapse of local authority house building for people on lower incomes. This is the single major factor. There's other factors too. We think this is the single major factor why we're in this mess we're in today, etc. So yeah, I'm nearly done. I've nearly finished my thing. And so we're basically, what we're trying to do in this report is to really find out there's lots of really excellent housing scheme being built by some local authorities in the country. So we're arguing that they can be scaled up. This is not inventing something new. There are models, etc. Some brilliant people working in this, some of the best architects in Britain working on this, etc. And so we're saying this should be scaled up. We're also arguing that it's also got to take into account environmental issues, etc. So we're looking at the retrofit, with 50% of dwellings should be reused dwellings. We're looking at the use of net zero low carbon technologies for heating homes, etc. And what we're saying really is that we have the knowledge, we have the people to do it. What we now need is the political will to actually do something about this problem and provide the kind of social housing that is needed in this country.
Thank you very much. On time. Perfect. Great. So I think next we have Kath Scanlon. So, so please go ahead.
I'm struggling with the technology here.
So it just slides over to.
There. All right. Can you hear me? Super. Can I just get an idea? Is there anybody in the room who is not from the UK? Thank you. Okay. So I'm also going to talk about temporary accommodation from a slightly different angle. I've done quite a bit of research on the cost of temporary accommodation to local authorities. So let me tell you a bit about that. So local authorities in this country, in London, these are boroughs, and outside of London, district councils. They are required to provide temporary accommodation to certain homeless households. Now, historically, this was mainly families with children, but the ambit has got more wide in recent years. This is a statutory duty, so local authorities don't have any choice about whether to do this or not. If the households are meet certain criteria, the local authorities must find accommodation for them. In 2017, there was an act passed called the Homelessness Reduction Act, and this aimed to help more households, especially single people who had really been left out of the system before that, and to prevent people becoming homeless in the first place. So this gives local authorities additional responsibilities for preventing homelessness, which can be done in various ways, by helping people out with their rent or by negotiating with landlords and so on. In London especially, but in many places in the country, there is a shortage of social housing, and turnover in social housing is very low. There's very few vacancies. So it's almost unheard of in London, certainly, but also in a lot of the rest of the country, for a homeless household to move directly into a social home. So they are placed into what's called temporary accommodation, or TA, and that's usually a rented home in the private rented sector, so owned by either an individual landlord or a company that has several properties, or occasionally a corporation. So there are a lot of issues with this system. First of all, in London especially, the private rented sector is very overheated. You all are young people, and I assume that some of you at least live in private renting yourself, and you know how difficult it is to find a place to rent. So imagine that you're a local authority trying to find a suitable place for a homeless household. You are competing not only with students and young professionals, but you're also competing with the Home Office, who's trying to find places for asylum seekers to live. You're competing with other local authorities, because local authorities don't only look within their own area, they can find places for people to live anywhere that they can find a suitable place. So the market is very overheated and there's a huge amount of competition. A lot of local authorities try to place families within their own boundaries, but that's not always possible. And also in London especially, rents are much cheaper on the edge of London than, say, in central London. So there's a lot of moving people around, sometimes for very great distances. Then children are, have to travel an hour each way to go to their schools and so on. Second, temporary accommodation is often not temporary in any real sense of the word. One recent study done by a colleague of mine of TA in 6 London boroughs, of which Camden is one, found that 45% of the households in TA had been there for more than 5 years. And I've interviewed households who have been in TA for 14 years. So that's not really temporary in a real sense. TA can be a very lucrative business for landlords. Even though households, it's very common for them to stay for years, many landlords charge by the night. So it can be a real money earner. And because of this great competition for places, the rates that local authorities are allowed to pay by the government system is well below the market rate. So local authorities have to offer so-called incentive payments to landlords that make up the difference between the rent that they can pay and the market rent. So it's a kind of, a top-up to what they're earning from the rent itself. So all of these factors together mean that TA is extremely costly for local authorities. They do get money from the government to compensate them for what they pay out on TA, but it doesn't cover the whole cost. It covers about 2/3 of the cost, we estimate roughly. They have to make up the rest from their own general financial resources. And because this is a duty, they don't have any choice about doing this, they must. That means they have to cut back on those things that are not legal duties. For example, provision of libraries, of leisure centers, of all these services that we know are being cut back. And these pressures have even led some local authorities to it contributed to local authorities going into bankruptcy, which has happened in several local authorities recently. So one of my solutions would be reforming the local government finance system, which is a whole other topic on itself that I won't go into now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Right, so Alex, would you like to go next? Thank you.
Great. So I can give you a kind of helicopter view of just how bad and live this situation is. I'm sure it was intended by the organisers, but the latest stats came out on homelessness this morning, so I can give you a kind of brief synopsis of those. A very kind of quick headline as to how we got into this mess, and then one or two kind of very, very superficial descriptions of what are very, I hope, or what I don't know, but what are probably going to be very difficult pathways out of this mess, but they are definitely achievable because we got into it. So the headline stats, rough sleeping, it's up by 27% on last year. It's risen in every region of England. It's risen most sharply in London by 32%. It's up 120% since 2010. And we are now back to where we were before the pandemic, where during the pandemic there was an everybody in policy that the government had. We're now back to where we were before that. So in many ways that just highlights how, in many respects, this is all a political choice, and we chose to get rid of it for very good public health reasons during the pandemic, and we're now back to where we were before then. Overall statutory homelessness, which Kath was describing the circumstances of how a family or how an individual becomes statutorily homeless, we're now at around about 300,000 families or households that are homeless or at risk of homelessness. 105,000 of those are in temporary accommodation, which has doubled over the last decade. And a stat earlier today that my colleagues at Generation Rent produced, we had 126,000 first-time buyers who bought their own home in the year leading up to September 2023. But we had 164,000 people find themselves homeless. So we had more people find themselves homeless than were able to get on the property ladder last year. I think one of the most shocking metrics by which we can measure homelessness is the number of children in temporary accommodation, for many of the reasons that Murray was outlining. We've got 142,000 children living in squalid, overcrowded, often infested, often unsuitable, often not temporary accommodation. That's equivalent, I don't know if any of you are from Ipswich, I doubt you are, but that is equivalent to a town the size of Ipswich, which for those of you not from the UK is not particularly small. And we have 85,000 children in London alone who live in temporary accommodation. You could just about fit them into Wembley Stadium. That's about the size, broadly speaking, of a parliamentary constituency in London full of homeless children. That number's up 96% since 2010. No fault evictions. I don't know if any of you have been served one, hopefully not. The government promised to abolish them in 2019. Their use is up 51% on last year. They're the means by which your landlord can serve you 2 months' notice without giving you any particular reason and just kick you out with 2 months' notice. They're up 51% on last year, and the number of occasions in which that has resulted in homelessness has gone up by 43% since 2019, when the government promised to abolish them, and they haven't yet got round to doing so. Very quick headlines as to how we got into this mess. There's been a huge tenure shift in the UK over the last 4 decades. The number of the proportion of homes that are for social rent, secure, affordable, previously lifetime, that's almost halved. And since the mid-1990s, when buy-to-let mortgages were introduced, the number of private rented sector properties has more than doubled. So we've had that tenure shift. It's meant that we've got more people in unaffordable, insecure housing and fewer people in secure, affordable housing. That drives homelessness. But we've also got an overall lack of supply, frankly, of all tenures, but particularly when it comes to homelessness, our primary focus is on affordable and social housing, which should be the safety net. We had a cliff edge in grant funding, so the government cut grant funding significantly in 2011. We've had a shift from social rent linked to local earnings and therefore genuinely affordable to more market-based forms of rent. Affordable rent, so-called, is linked to market rate. It's 80% of market rate. And councils are hamstrung for a number of factors, which I definitely don't have time to go into now. And housing associations are treading water, trying to do 10 things at the same time while they're not being provided with the resources to do, frankly, any of them. How do we get out of this mess very, very quickly? The government needs to properly make sure that their renters reform bill, which is going through Parliament right now, does the things which they originally said it would set out to do, the headline of which, there's loads of things they could do, but the headline is scrap no-fault evictions. Number two, to get to grips with this, the immediacy of this homelessness crisis and the sharply rising figures that I was just describing, the government need to deal with some of the issues which Kath was mentioning there about unfreezing the rate at which councils get their top-up from central government, because it is driving many of them to the brink of bankruptcy. They literally cannot cope with this rising problem. There was a stat yesterday put out on the BBC. It's costing London councils alone £90 million a month of their own finances to deal with this. So the government needs to resolve that. It's quite straightforward. They also need to encourage councils to buy homes from landlords who want to sell at the moment because of rising interest rates. I'm doing a paper at the moment for the GLA and the Mayor of London, which hopefully can outline some of these programmes that the Mayor of London is already doing, and hopefully mayors across the country can be given similar powers to do so. And thirdly, and by far the most important, we need to build a new generation of social homes. We used to build between the Second World War and 1980 around about 126,000 social homes a year. Last year, we only built 7,500. That's fewer than the 28,000 that were sold or demolished, including the 11,000 that were sold under right to buy. And very, very finally, there was a report out earlier this week from Shelter and the National Housing Federation, which showed that building 90,000 homes, which is generally accepted as the pathway out of this, every year over the next 15 years, for each year it will generate £51.2 billion of positive economic, social impact. The positive impacts of that will be felt after 3 years, and that social housing would pay for itself after 11 years. And fundamentally, as well as those economic benefits, it would reduce the social benefits of homelessness, which is driving at the heart of this, and all of the numbers that we're throwing around, is a story about human misery.
Thank you. And then...
Yeah. Yeah, human misery. Perfect intro. I have been homeless now for 15 years. I lost a property that I lived in on the south bank of London in 2009 due to a credit file error, and I've been through pretty much every initiative that has been delivered by all local authorities out there. And it's interesting to hear each of the speakers this evening, because one of the big problems with a lot of this is actually the very people you go to for assistance. The local authorities, the Department of Work and Pensions, the local charities, everything is kind of skewed to not assist. And obviously that's the first thing you need. So I was actually sleeping at Heathrow Airport when lockdown was announced. And this everyone in slogan, no legislation change whatsoever, was brought in, and they said, get everyone in. And I was brought into hotel accommodation. And I've been in hotel accommodation ever since. That has cost Westminster Council over £250,000, giving that to Whitbread to keep me in that accommodation, because they've been paying it, as was mentioned, per night, and not block booking and going, right, we're going to put 100,000, I think it's 130,000 people currently in Premier Inns across as temporary accommodation. So rather than negotiating that as a flat rate, saying everybody 50 quid a night, that's it, they'll actually pay the fluctuating rates per night. And on one occasion, they paid over £400 for me to stay in a plaza, which is madness. It's utter madness. They may well have just bought me a house that they owned, and therefore lost the cost. So you've got this really bizarre scenario happening right across Britain, where we've got more than enough empty homes sitting in various areas to house every person experiencing homelessness right now. Right now. Now, some of these are accommodation that have been built and not sold. Some of it is that they've been sold and not lived in. And some of it is just accommodation that isn't fit to live in at the moment, but could be made fit to live in if people chose to. We've also got this really strange connection between luxury apartments and affordable housing, where people make sure that the people who are in affordable housing do not feel part of that community by introducing things like portals and going, you can't swim in the nice swimming pool, or use the garden for your children if you're in affordable housing. And affordable housing, of course, is 2/3 of market rent or market purchase, which is often £2,000 to £3,000 a week. And in some cases, people are buying places for £750,000 under the banner of affordable housing, which is madness in my concern. Another part of the problem often is that people who are experiencing homelessness often can figure their own ways out of it. Every piece of research across the world, here in London in 2010, I think it was, and again in Canada in 2021, they basically went out to people experiencing homelessness saying, how much money do you need to solve the problem? And more often than not, it's hundreds of pounds, sometimes thousands, but nobody asked for hundreds of thousands. And all the systems prevent you from creating your own solution. They go, no, you've got to fill in this form. You have to do it this way. You've got to live in this type of accommodation. So that creates an even bigger problem. We've obviously got buildings going up now that have ceased to be built, so there should be more legislation that forces local authorities to get developers to deliver on their what they've started. Airbnb is a huge problem in central London. We've read in Wired about the developers across over in Vauxhall who literally bought off plan and then own the entire block of accommodation, which they're then renting out as Airbnb property. Now, obviously, Airbnb makes it much, much easier to make lots of profit, none of the responsibility. And just finally, the buy-to-let mortgage has created a real problem. Because buy-to-let mortgage is usually an individual trying to add to their own asset and their own income. and they don't negotiate in the same way as a business developer would. So they'll go, I need this amount of money to pay my mortgage, as opposed to what is the market rent. So on one spectacular occasion, I was negotiating with a potential landlord, and I said to him, you haven't let your property for 6 months, and you want £2,000. That's, in essence, you've lost £12,000. I can ease that loss by paying you £300 less than you want, but they said, no, we're just going to wait. And that's not good business sense. They were happily losing money as opposed to getting some money and appeasing their losses. And I think that's my time.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for your... I have to behave myself with this thing. Okay, so thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Really, really interesting. Before we open it up for Q&A, maybe I just get to ask one question, and then we can open up to the audience for theirs. Do you have any, key 1 or 2, 3 points that you think could help us get us out of this mess from your own sort of perspective? I don't know if anybody wants to go first, or yeah.
Thanks. Well, the ways out of it depend on what you regard as within the boundary of potential solutions, right? So you could nationalize all housing in the country, just government could take it over and could assign who gets to live in every home, which is basically what happened after in a lot of communist countries in the 20th century. And then you could make sure no homes were empty and everybody has a home. That is unlikely to happen in the current system. I think we can agree. So things that have more potential. I completely agree about changing the system by which local government gets reimbursed by central government for the money it is spending on temporary accommodation. But I would go further and say that the local government finance system needs complete reform to give local authorities much more control over what they spend, and also more ability to generate income, which it's a very big topic. But for those of you who, for example, maybe there are people in the room from the States, local authorities can raise whatever taxes they want in the States. Not the case here. Local authorities have no fiscal independence, so I would give them fiscal independence. And I completely agree about building more affordable housing. That is at root what's going to solve the problem.
I'm glad you asked, Rod, because I've got 12 here, yeah? The recommendations for our report, and I will just tell you them. First of all, a broader and longer-term economic vision is needed for house building. Yeah, we're just not even thinking properly about housing. Health benefits, NHS savings must be factored into housing evaluations, or not, at the moment. A differential housing policy is required for all the UK's diverse regions. And again, this is another hangover that there has to be a single national policy. There doesn't. There needs to be differentiation. Right to buy should end in England for all future social rent dwellings. Bring it into line with Scotland and Wales. Tenure-blind social mixing is vital in all new social and affordable housing schemes. Fixed requirements must be set to establish housing design quality. No more small boxes, proper homes. Net zero standards must be adopted to cut operational carbon. Initiatives are needed to expand green skills training in house building. Local authority participation in house building has to be majorly revived, and I think this is the only way we're going to get to this as well. Local authorities need to have greater financial flexibility, as has been mentioned. Retrofitted dwellings should be encouraged by VAT exemption. At the moment, you pay 20% on retrofitting a dwelling and you pay 5% on new build. It's crazy. And also special measures are needed for rural, social and affordable housing. This is one of the things we couldn't go into in our report, but in some ways we're worried about problems in London, but there's absolutely almost complete stasis in terms of rural house building for people on lower incomes.
Okay. Murray, you did that remarkably quickly. I was getting a little worried there for a second. All right, thank you. Alex? Yeah.
I mean, there's loads of things you need to do. The housing crisis is so deep and deepening that you need to do everything at all times. But if I had to do one thing over the next 15 to 20 years, it would be to build 90,000 genuinely social houses for rent. The only way to do, there are lots of things that you need to do to get councils and housing associations in a position whereby they can do that, because at the moment, they're not, for lots and lots of very deeply entrenched reasons. But in our hypothetical world where I've got 10 seconds to give an answer, and they are able to do that, they need the grant funding to do that. At the moment, they do not have the grant funding to provide new homes for social rent. Generally speaking, back of a fag packet, but the amount of grant funding that comes from central government to councils and housing associations, in broad terms, need to quadruple from where it is now. So that would be the one thing that I would want.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
One thing or three things?
Three, Max.
Three things. All right. Okay, first and foremost, we have got to establish in British law the notion of housing as a human right. It seems ludicrous to suggest that we don't already have that, but we don't. I'm working with Amnesty currently on development and other organisations where we're trying to kind of entrench it in law. It's not as easy as people think it is, but that's certainly got to be our starting point. The second one is that we've got to change public opinion away from the notion of homes as property and assets and rental revenue, because while that remains, you are always going to have this problem. And actually, Britain has a good sense, which I'm just reading this book now, and it talks about how the development and the evolution of the street. And Leicester Square has legislated to have mixed communities for its entirety. You can't change that. It's enshrined from about the 1600s. And we need lots more of that. So we need mixed groups, housing as a human right, and a change of attitude from the public towards housing as homes, not housing as revenue.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So we'll now open it up for Q&A from the audience. So if you would like to ask one of our guests a question, please put your hand up and go ahead. Yeah.
On the bottom?
Do you want to?
Yeah, we'll do it with a read.
Sorry. Oh God, this is even more embarrassing. I've never asked a question before. I just thought I would ask a question because I used to be a support worker in Hackney for rough sleepers for Single Homeless Project charity, and it was started in an everyone in hotel. And did the best we could with very little resources, and there was about 200 people with extremely high and complex needs, and obviously it closed down when COVID ended, as they say, and we had to get everyone into accommodation in Hackney, which there is none, and Hackney's had a sort of cyber attack under their belt for about 1 million years, so they're just, don't do anything. But there was obviously, there is no housing first to put anyone in, and it's pretty horrible. What it is. I don't know if everyone's been to Ridley Road before, but they filmed Top Boy there, just to say. But it's horrible. It's really horrible, and it's not a place that I want to send anyone. So that's disgusting. Anyway, there is a question, but there's no resources on mental health and drug and alcohol services, which is what a lot of people I was supporting needed. So firstly, people going into homes actually felt really hard to sustain a tenancy or anything because they couldn't. And also felt really, it's hard to go from sleeping on the street to then sleeping in a bed and having a kitchen and doing your utilities, tax, everything. So, you need someone to support you. But also I really agree with what your thought is in that I think everyone needs to change. It needs to be a shift in thought of people are not just sitting on the street because they want to sit on the street. It needs to be everyone deserves a house and everything like that. But basically, do you think it is just housing, or do you think it is just, is that it? If there was better housing, that would be it? Or do you think it needs to be, obviously council have no money and it's a big thing, but I think there's also a massive shift, it needs to be a shift in government. And who's going to do that? Basically, that's my question. Who's going to do that? How long? And just housing.
Okay. In answer to the first one, I think it's really important to remember that homelessness is a huge problem and affects absolutely everybody. Finnish idea of housing first, which is this notion of a wraparound service. So you're given a home and then you're given all the support to maintain that home, seems to be the most logical, and we're trialing it pretty much everywhere across the UK at the moment. But again, part of the problem is the money argument, right? You always come back to the money argument. But as I said, if you look at the cost of, or the wasted cost that Westminster Council, in my case, are doing, actually, all it would take is, and we talked about this earlier, it requires those budget bubbles to be taken away. So, for instance, they can house me in a hotel because it's not coming out of universal credit. If they wanted to house me in private rented accommodation, they don't have the funds to do that. So it would be cheaper to do that, but they come from separate pots. So you need that kind of thinking. You need holistic thinking so that you remove the pots. And you also need to remember that homelessness is a huge, huge problem. One of the big problems with accounts is it only catches people who engage with services. So when I was at Heathrow, they were saying, you know, they were coming out with, there was around 4,000 rough sleepers in Britain. They housed 37,000 of us, which meant there were 33,000 people that had never come across anybody's radar. And that's a huge problem. And it's that what they call invisible homelessness. So yeah, that's what I think needs to happen, is you need to completely change your thinking in terms of these pools of budgets and look at the problem holistically and accept that, you know, there are a small, very, very small minority who have complex needs that need to have greater protections than other people would do.
Yeah, I think what you said at the end was something like, who's going to fix this, or how are we going to fix it? And I think ultimately this stuff is the product of a combination for decades of various political choices, and they are political choices which can be unmade. We got into this mess. We can get out of this mess. So the statistics are shocking. They are an underreporting. You're absolutely right. And nevertheless, they are still shocking. But they needn't cause a sense of helplessness, because housing, for example, will be on the ballot paper in the general election later this year. I don't know how many of you can vote, but it will be. And that is the first time, I would say, in probably my lifetime, that housing will be on the ballot paper in the way that it's going to be in this forthcoming general election. The major parties will have an offer, and we're starting to hear what those offers are. There is a difference. It's up to all of us to make our own views up as to which one we prefer. But I will be looking to see which party will be talking about a genuine pathway to building the social housing that is needed to fix the problem. And I would recommend that we all do the same, because it isn't a kind of futile, oh, what we're going to do, isn't this such a mess, isn't this terrible? There are solutions, they're out there. It's actually not rocket science as well, because we've had worse housing crises than this. After the Second World War, half of London was bombed out. We sorted that out. We can sort this out.
Yeah, just to echo that as well, we've almost got to the Labour Party housing minister in waiting, I should say. Anyway, so I think there is a bit of a shift going on, but it's not definite as well. And then just to echo what Alex said, I mean, as architects, we've always got to believe there's a positive, constructive kind of future as well. Now, at the moment, the cover we used here, my sort of recommendation for the policy to follow is actually in the city of York, which curiously enough happens to have a housing delivery officer who used to work for the Roundtree Trust, who's a brilliant man. Should be, knighted straight away. But anyway, they're building amazing housing, and small scale, because it's a small thing there, and they're building housing. And I keep on stressing this, at these new net zero energy targets, they're building housing that need only 20% of the energy of a typical house. They're building amazing houses. They're being built by probably the best housing architects in the country. They're incredible, So exactly, we can do it. It's about actually realising that. It's about political will. That's what I think.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? I think, and then, yeah.
Thank you very much. Really interesting stuff. Yeah, this is a question kind of about the mixed housing thing, because I'm really, really partial to that as an idea. However, I read recently that Blair, back in the good old days of funding, popped in a policy of mixed housing, and that did not go particularly well because it led to kind of gentrification in council house areas and kind of ended up becoming a way of segregating, but communities ended up getting split off. So I was wondering if the mixed housing policies you were kind of suggesting had measures to prevent that, or what kind of measures those would include.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in a Scottish council estate. It was 100% working class, and I think there are dangers as well. I mean, my sympathy is with the maximum amount of general social rent housing as possible as well. But talking to the experts, somebody like the person at York, there's obviously, because of the complex finances and the different aspirations of people now, that it's better to probably have a social mix as well. So basically their recipe, and they're experimenting this in the York schemes about, what should the balance be, etc. And roughly the mix that they're recommending, and which we took up, was the idea of 50% social rent dwellings, which actually, if it applied in London, would make a real big difference. In London, it's a lot less than 50%. So if you get 50%, and then the number 30% for affordable housing, which is really housing for people who might want to, through shared ownership or what have you, or things, buy a house, and then 20% at market rent to subsidise the rest as well. And they're saying this is a sort of a good economic balance, and it's also got social benefits as well. But the other thing is obviously saying it must be, as I was saying before, it must be tenure blind. The housing must be exactly the same. There should be no differentiation whatsoever. There should be no doors, anything like that at all. It should be the same housing for everybody, and people could have different types of tenure depending on, their economic income and what they want as well. And also, I think we're using the argument that if you actually provide affordable housing that can be bought, then right to buy should go. Yeah. Yep. There's no need for it anymore.
Mixed community is great. We need more of them. I think what a lot of councils have to do at the moment, almost by necessity, is if a council has the political will to build old school council housing at social rent, because the numbers don't add up for them and they don't have the grant levels in able to do that, what they do is they often cross-subsidise. So they'll build a house for market sale in order to cross-subsidise a home for social rent. So in a way, the dysfunctional system we have at the moment does in some respects lead to that kind of mixed tenure developments. But I would say going forward, the kind of big thing to watch out for, and this is a very long-term thing, but the leader of the opposition has talked about building 10 new towns in England. Again, not reinventing the wheel. That was exactly what was done after the Second World War to alleviate the housing crisis then. The key question for me, great idea, great, fantastic, crack on, but they need to be mixed communities. So social housing needs to play a huge role in that in order for those places to be affordable places. But also just beyond the housing, they need to be nice places for people to live. They need to be ecologically sustainable. You need to have, I know it's the subject of very bizarre conspiracy theories, but you need to be able to go to your GP, your school, your child's school, etc. within 15 minutes, dare I say it. So that all needs to be. It's the housing is the driver of it. Is the reason why we're talking about new towns and what I would hope would be a mixed community within that new town. But generally, it's about making a nice place that people want to live in.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Oh,
I think
can I-
we. Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I think one of the key parts about the sort of mixed housing is, again, it's back to price, right? So when I first moved to London in 2000, I was looking to live on the river. So the 3 places I lived before I became homeless was Tower Bridge, Vauxhall Bridge, and I finally ended up on Waterloo. And I was able to do that on housing benefit rates. Right, so the last place I lived in, 2-bed, 2-bath, swimming pool in the basement, terrace overlooking the London Eye and views over St Paul's, was costing me £800 a month, and that was in 2009. That place now rents at £3,500 a week. So that's part of it, is that you've got to shift it. But in this book, they talk about the Georgian period where Georgians went, right, all of these have to look and feel the same. So you can only build certain types of building, and it's depending on how wide the street is, and it was affordable to everybody, and that was the whole point, everybody, and therefore you have these mixed areas. London has changed dramatically in 10 years. You know, it used to be a clutter of villages that just connected. And every, Brixton had its own identity, Hackney had its own identity, Shoreditch was, Soho, very much so. And all of that's now been obliterated because it's just the drive for money. So it's rebalancing that to allow everybody to join the party, as it were.
Okay, just because I haven't said anything, I'm just going to throw this out there. Nice to hear that the Labour Party is thinking about re-examining the Greenbelt and thinking about whether there's parts of it that might be better used for housing than for weeds.
Thank you. I think we had a question at the back there. Yeah.
This is on? Yes, thank you. So this question is mainly for Kath. If I understood you correctly, a solution to the problem might be more government authority over or to decide where people live. Do you think that this would then negatively affect the ability for people to choose for themselves?
I should make clear that was a joke. I was not advocating nationalization of the housing stock and the government assigning people places to live. I was kidding.
Then that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah, just before you move on that one, though, because the point is really interesting, because what was mentioned earlier is that often if you're experiencing homelessness in a particular borough, so in Westminster, for instance, where the highest population of homelessness occurs in the entirety of the British Isles, people will be moved out of that area because it's cheaper to do so. And therefore, they don't have the choice. They have that removed. It's dictated by a local authority about where you live, purely conditional on the cost of the area.
Yes, that is true, and it's not only that people are sometimes moved to an adjacent borough or to a borough at the edge of London. It can happen that somebody who becomes homeless in London might be sent to live in Birmingham or in Hastings or another town on the south coast. Now, that's happening now probably less than it used to, but it still can happen, and that's not a happy situation.
Very awful.
Yes. Hello. Thank you. First of all, sorry that I was the one who was slightly late. So if my question is also about stuff that you talked about before, very sorry. My question is just sort of more on sort of different perspective of sort of women who tend to escape sort of violence or sexual abuse and kind of go into domestic centres and shelters there. Do you know if they're counted within the sort of homelessness population? And the stats there.
Yes. Is broken if I was able to bring up I can pull you out the exact number. Sorry. Yeah. So that specific information. The reason why an individual or a household becomes homeless is recorded is recorded by local authorities, and it's then reported to central government, and that is, for obvious reasons, a really significant driver of homelessness amongst those people. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know you've mentioned a few already, but what do you think would be the most impactful non-financial interventions that the government could make to either help solve the problem or to instigate more house building?
It won't cost them a penny. They've talked about doing it since 2019. They should just scrap no-fault evictions. It's going through. There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment called the Renters Reform Bill. It's the government have been wringing their hands over this. It probably won't surprise you to hear that a significant number of government backbench MPs are landlords themselves and have something to say about what the law should or should not do on this issue. No-fault evictions mean that all of you who are currently renting privately, I'm sorry to break the news, but all of you who are renting privately from a private landlord at the moment, your landlord can serve you 2 months' notice and you needn't have done anything wrong whatsoever. Renters in this country have some of the weakest protections in the world. And what that does, particularly in the situation at the moment where you've got rising rents, if I'm a landlord and I didn't give a toss about what circumstances my tenants were facing or might face, I was locked into a 12-month tenancy, and I go on Zoopla or Rightmove, even 2-3 months later, and I think, actually, God, rents have gone up. I could probably charge a bit more, couldn't I? I'll serve my current tenant 2 months' notice, get them out, get someone else in. So when rents are rising and protections are so weak, there's almost an incentive for landlords to do, frankly, the wrong thing and issue their tenants with Section 21 no-fault eviction notices. The government could end all of that. They could end that with the bill that's going through Parliament right now. But instead what they're doing is they're watering it down because there's a lot of, a lot of their backbenchers, frankly, just don't want it to happen. So that won't cost them a penny. Do it now.
Yeah, and sorry, as I was saying, this area of not financial, I think the idea of not wasting money on temporary accommodation and actually spending and saving money by building new housing, I would say that was non-financial as well,
I take the approach, as I said earlier, there's enough empty housing dotted across, well, even just central London, to house everybody experiencing homelessness, and that just requires a shift in legislation so that there can't be empty homes available, and that will bring those into the market. It'll impact on lowering prices and everything else. But fundamentally, there's no cost to doing that, and it will just encourage more properties to come into the market.
No, I will.
Thank you.
I'll pass.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, we've got lots of questions. Okay, great. So we'll go down here.
Hello. Like a bunch of us, I'm from Norway on a student trip, and so we don't know as much about the housing crisis in the UK as you guys do, but seems very apparent is that a large part of the housing crisis comes from the rise in property, in massive rise in rent in London. Has rent control been an issue? Is it a realistic issue in the UK Parliament today, and what kind of obstacles does that case face in Parliament right now?
Okay, thanks for the question. The UK has a very centralised system of government. Local authorities are only allowed to do those things that Parliament explicitly allows them to do. It's not a federal system. In Scotland, the government has what they call devolved powers over housing. That means Scotland can make its own housing policy, and Scottish legislation does allow for the possibility of rent control. It hasn't been used, but that possibility exists. In England, rent control is not, local authorities are not permitted to introduce rent control. Sadiq Khan, the current mayor of London, has been making the case for a long time that he would like to have the power to control rents. I think the possibility of that happening, well, certainly under conservative government, which we have at the moment, is zero. And I think personally, I think it's unlikely if we have a Labour government in the next administration, although we'll see. But it's not something that local governments are allowed to do in this country. It would take national legislation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good and reasonable question, given that there are lots of countries and jurisdictions where rent controls do operate. I wouldn't say a skeptic, but I think we have to be really, really careful with rent controls. There are many, and when you have I've been to quite a few meetings and discussions with tenants and landlords about rent controls, and the moment the words are mentioned, you are faced with what I think is actually a reasonable question of, well, can you tell me somewhere where they've worked well? And that is a difficult question to answer because, frankly, there are more places where it hasn't worked well than has worked well. That said, there are places where it has worked well. And to the one that's at the top of my head is Barcelona is a place where that has been done quite well. It hasn't led to a right, because the criticism of them, depending on how they're formulated, can be that it can incentivise, depending on exactly what's done, but it can incentivise a landlord to evict their tenant in order to get another tenant in so they can charge at a higher rate. It depends on the model, but there have definitely been places around the world where that has happened, and that's led to a rise in homelessness, paradoxically. That said, they can be devised and designed, I think, far better. And, I think on their own, are they the solution to many of these problems? Probably not. Could they be part of the package? Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up in South Wales, and we didn't abolish rent caps until about 1988. And they worked effectively well, and the local authority had the ability to come in and assess, based on the size and floor space and number of rooms, etc., the maximum amount of money that landlord could charge you for the property. And that seemed to work effectively well, and it only really disappeared with the buy-to-let mortgage coming in and the right to buy.
All right, thank you. I think we had another question here, and then Alan, then back over here.
It was just about no-fault evictions. I think a lot of landlords use no-fault evictions because they couldn't get rid of somebody who couldn't, never paid the rent or smashed the place up through the courts. So unless the courts are sorted out, that's probably why a lot of landlords have actually sold. Probably a lot of good landlords have sold because they're frightened they wouldn't be able to get rid of a bad tenant.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think and that is, if Michael Gove was sat here right now and you asked him, why aren't you doing this, Minister? You promised to do this in 2019. His response would be, well, the courts are so backlogged that we couldn't possibly ask the court system to deal with the extra strain that you would have from abolishing no-fault evictions. I mean, my answer to that would be, well, you've been in power for the last 14 years and you can kind of sort that out as well. But notwithstanding that, landlords under what's proposed in the Renters Reform Bill will still have a menu of other options with which to evict their tenants should those circumstances apply, things like arrears. And you're absolutely right. Many of them will think to themselves, well, why would I go to that trouble when I can just, no questions asked, bish, bash, bosh, out you go, 2 months, see you later. I think that's absolutely right, because that's the world we're living in now. I would, and I think many campaigners who've worked on this for decades, frankly, to bring us to the point whereby this should be going through Parliament, because the government have promised to do it, and the Labour Party have said if they win the election, they will just get on and do it. We've got to this point, and the world in which no-fault evictions are abolished, which frankly is the situation for most parts, if not, I don't know this, but most parts, if not all of Europe, for example, they don't have no-fault evictions. That would be a better world in which that option is not available. And as I said, that is a key. If we're here today to talk about homelessness and why homelessness is so sharply rising, that's a key driver of it, because it's so cut and dry. If you're given a Section 21 no-fault eviction notice, and you go on Rightmove or Zoopla and you look around, you know, can I afford to rent here anymore? Oh, crikey, no, I can't, because rents have gone up 20% over the last year. What am I going to do? I'm going to present myself as homeless to the council. So it's such a kind of clear cause and effect contributor to the current mess. It seems to me to be a pretty open and shut case. And those landlords will still have a menu of options. So for arrears, they will still be able to evict their tenant should the tenant not pay the rent.
Thank you. I think, Alan, yeah.
Thanks so much. This has been such a rich conversation, so thank you to you all. My question is actually about something that Murray said very close to the start. You said that there are some local authorities that are doing good things, while lots are not. I just wonder what's different about those local authorities. Is it a matter of political complexion? Is it that they've got better finances? What's different?
Sure, Kath, and others know more than me, but this is the story we couldn't speak to many people, but we talked to quite a few places around there, and it seemed to be the case, obviously, that local authorities are so embattled financially, etc., but also they've kind of lost the vision to be able to put together a constructive housing policy. And the common factor we found, and there were places like Camden Council was very good. There's some very good places. It was the kind of injection of somebody with a fresh idea, a sort of a catalyst agent, you know, who could come into a situation where they think there's no hope. And as I said, like this person at York who used to work for Roundtree Trust, he knows this stuff as well. And there's a really interesting sort of organisation called Public Practice, and their role really now is to actually to recruit young architects and planners, etc., to go into local authorities to be those catalyst agents, and so they actually place people in there as well. Now, it's really quite remarkable what that then can happen, because quite often it just takes the creative vision. Really, I mean, it's a difficult thing. I mean, I'm sure, as I say, other people know much more about this as well, but there are models of doing it. But I think that's the secret that we could find as well. But I mean, I don't know if anyone thinks so.
I agree that it really helps to have a charismatic person who really will be the champion for this within the authority. Sometimes it's the leader or the mayor, and sometimes it's somebody else within the authority. And one of the things that local authorities do have in their favor is that they tend to own a lot of land. And land, if you have the land, that's a lot of your problems sorted. On the other hand, often the land that they own is the land where there are existing council estates, which brings us into the realm of regeneration of council estates, which on its own is a whole another very contentious topic. But take somebody who really wants that policy, assemble a database of where all the land is, and that can drive the move forward. And it doesn't have to be a rural area. As Murray said, Camden has done some very interesting things, and it's one of the most densely settled places in England.
So I think, as people said, it depends who you get actually in the institution. I mean, from a homelessness perspective, boroughs often will be dictated by their populaces. So if you look at Tower Hamlets, for instance, they've taken a social prescribing model, and a vicar and a doctor got together with some property developers and says, right, we're going to fix this problem, and got Prince Charles's backing, and suddenly they went to the council and go, right, we're going to fix the problem. And that's exactly what they did, and we're seeing that being emulated across the country. So yeah, I think a lot of it is down to the people that work in it. They're jaded office workers or jaded frontline workers, but they're... Again, it comes back to how creative you can be within the boundaries that you're set about how you can develop things. So obviously in Westminster, they spent £6 million on a mound of earth at the end of Oxford Street. Now, there would have been better ways to spend that money, right? So you've got all that. But you've also got the other side of it where you look in Southwark and the battle with the Aylesbury estate, where the people in Southwark planning have all now been given huge payouts to go work in as advisors for commercial developers. And that's become a huge thing within local authorities, where you're seeing that. And obviously the Aylesbury estate fight has been won momentarily, in a Royal Course a few weeks ago. But it's that there is a lot of corruption within the systems that also needs to be ironed out.
Okay, maybe one last question, and then we're probably going to have to wrap it up.
Sorry, thank you. I have lots of questions, to be honest, but I'll just ask one. One thing that often comes up when you talk about homelessness is the idea of second homes being a huge problem. Holiday homes in particular. I think in a lot of rural communities that I'm familiar with, holiday homes are a huge issue. They push up local house prices, make things unaffordable for people. And I'm just curious by the fact that that's something sort of that hasn't really come up, the idea of like a second home tax. And I know it's something that they consider in a lot of other countries. And yeah, curious as to the fact that that hasn't been mentioned. And is that effective? Is there a reason it hasn't been mentioned?
Well, in a sense, there is a second home tax because when you buy a second home, you pay an extra amount of stamp duty land tax if you already own a home. But on council tax, I think I'm right in saying in England there is no surcharge for second homes, but Wales.
There is.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject. But you're you're right that second homes, especially in rural kind of tourist hotspots, are a huge issue. I think mentally I've been mainly thinking about London. There are second homes here, obviously, you know, from rich people from the Gulf and so on, but it's not so prominent. But certainly there's definitely a case for much heavier taxation of second homes to encourage more efficient use of the housing stock.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. There's tax is one form by which you could disincentivise people from acquiring second homes, because in those hotspots, you're absolutely right, it's a huge driver of house prices, and a lot of local people in those communities can't live there anymore, young people particularly. Regulation is another form, and there are some pretty credible options out there to properly regulate platforms like Airbnb, which is the vehicle through which a lot of people sweat the asset that is their second home. Far more lucrative to do that than a kind of bog standard private rented sector lettings. Lots of ways in which we could properly control that. I know I did go there and they did show me the ropes, but Barcelona is another city which does properly regulate its Airbnbs very, very effectively. They've got 3 zones in the city, one where they don't really care if you've got an Airbnb or not because there's not high pressure on housing, one where they just want you to notify them that you're renting it out, and one where you will not be able to get a license to Airbnb, and if you do, you're hit with a big fine. So funnily enough, people don't do it, and that has had a real impact on local people's ability to rent a home at an affordable rate. And that's the kind of thing which our government has started, to be fair to it, has started going down this road. They recently responded to a consultation where they're starting to think along these lines, but there is plenty more you could do with things like holiday lettings and Airbnbs to make sure that the tourism industry is sustained, and because the tourism industry will bring a lot of jobs to those communities as well, but also properly balance that against local people's needs to have an affordable home that they can actually live in.
All right, great. We are out of time, I'm afraid. So thank you. Before we thank our speakers, I need to remind you all about our next Policy and Practice event, which is entitled Women in British Politics, Progress, Pitfalls and Prospects, on next Thursday, 7th of March. And you can sign up via our website and Eventbrite. If you don't already follow us on Twitter and Insta, our handle is UCLSPP, where you can keep up to date with all our forthcoming events. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking our speakers for this really insightful.